So we need to speak about the Second World War. Um, there's so many different parts to this war that it's sort of hard um, to condense it all. So, but we'll try. So in early 1933, the war actually started um, before the United States ever got into it. We didn't get into it until 1941, but this whole situation had been ramping up since 1933. Hitler had gotten into power um, earlier than that, but he had um, he had allied with these guys. This is Benito Mussolini, who was a fascist dictator in Italy. This is Germany, and he was also a dictator, Adolf Hitler. I think he's pretty obvious. And then in Japan, you had these ultra-nationalist militarists, which they were convinced that they should, basically what they wanted to do, Hitler wanted to control all of Europe and eventually the world, but Europe. And this is Emperor Hirohito, and he wanted to control all of Asia and the eastern part of the world, so China and Asia and all of the Southeast Asia. They violated all these international laws by invading neighboring countries. The Japanese invaded China and started causing trouble, and then Hitler goes and invades Poland a little bit later. So you had these three, and basically Mussolini was allied with Hitler because of the proximity, the location. So by 1919, you had communism that was on the rise, and fascism was on the rise. And so communism was based on a classless society because it was like a knee-jerk reaction to the czars, because the czars had been living um, such lavish lifestyles, while all the people outside um, were, you know, starving basically. And so that's where the saying "let them eat cake." It comes from the last Russian czars. They saw the poor people outside in the freezing cold, and the one of the czarina said, "Let them eat cake." Well, the cake was not cake like we're talking about. It's like how the flour and the um, butter or the Crisco um, is left on the cake pan. That's the cake that she was mentioning. So she was not talking about eating real cake that was actually good. She was talking about the leftovers in the bottom of the cake pan. So they share all the property. The workers are paid based on what they need. The government controls all of the production. So there are huge shortages of all sorts. Russia was famous for having shortages of food and household goods and things because the government didn't worry about supply and demand. There wasn't a market economy like we have, where things that are in high demand, or there's more of them produced, um, and the companies can produce them. The government decides how much, like in Russia. And then fascism was a radical totalitarian government, which is actually really horrible. And they use propaganda and force to get absolute control over everything. Everything. Um, Not a place you want to live. So you had fascism in Germany and Italy, and then there was Japan, and they were a master race with a mission to conquer and lead Asia on a resurgence. So by 1941, there were only about 12 democratic countries left on Earth. Everybody else, you had this radical people. They were all about patriotism, emotionalism, and they said, it was all these claims of racial superiority. Hitler thought the Aryan race was the best. The Japanese thought the Asian race was the best, and they were all mad about the defeat, particularly Hitler, the defeat in World War One. So in 1922, Mussolini seized power. He was a political journalist, and so there was a government that couldn't deal with the inflation and the unemployment and this again is the end of at the end of World War One, and the whole nation, the whole world was in any time after a huge conflict like that, you have a depression or a recession. So the war was over in 1918, and they had several years, couple of 3 years, that were really bad economically around the world. So you had Il Duce was his name, and it meant the leader. He got rid of all the parties. There was nobody else that opposed him, and they had this declining industrial power, and they were pitiful in World War One. So he was going to bring them back. Germany, 33, Hitler's elected Chancellor of Germany, and he says democracy must be destroyed. Recruits 12 million stormtroopers just to be intimidating. He was a social misfit, and he became the leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party. He represented the Aryan race, which actually Aryans are rooted in or originated in India. But he's convinced that the Aryan race, they're blonde and blue-eyed, that they're supposed to be the most superior, purity and strength, and it was all threatened by everybody else. He later will liberals, Jews, communists, homosexuals, gypsies, and anybody else that he could find that he thought was inferior. Also handicapped people, the very old, the very sick, anybody else. So he unites the Germans. He makes them proud to be German again, basically, because they were blamed with starting World War One, which they did, and they deserved it. But they were forced to pay all these reparations, and the treaties that they signed at the end of the war limited their military ability to increase their military stockpiles and their military capability. So they were very resentful. The Germans were very resentful, and their economic situation was terrible too. So he wanted to gain land to expand. He wants to dominate these inferior races, and he wants to get rid of all the Jewish people. He was called the Fuhrer, and the Gestapo was the police force that was secret police. He bans all parties except the Nazis, just like Mussolini got rid of all the parties. All these people were stripped of their voting rights. There were no labor unions, no elections, and no strikes. And you didn't dare to speak out against it. So it was tyranny, terrorism, propaganda, and censorship. They burned books. He persecuted, imprisoned, murdered communist Jews and any sympathizers. So you had best not say anything in support of anybody else except the Nazi Party for fear of your life. So this gets bigger and bigger. In 1932, you had 10,000 Japanese troops that went in, and they went over into China in the northeast and Manchuria, and they occupied it. And they had the Chinese Civil War, which was Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek. And so it was renamed the Republic of Manchukuo, and it was the first major step to control China. And Japan is geographically a small country, so you think about trying to control this huge country like China. So in 1934, the Japanese had an aggressive military buildup. Then Mussolini from Italy in 35 goes in and invades the Ethiopia. Now the League of Nations from World War One got involved with sanctions, but they had a racist leader, and but the Europeans preferred the horde of barbarian Negroes, as they said, in Ethiopia over Italy, because it was Ethiopia was the mother of civilization. In 1935, Hitler violates the Versailles Treaty from World War One and rebuilds their military forces in Germany. 1936, you got 35,000 soldiers that go into the Rhineland, which is the demilitarized buffer zone between France and Germany. There's a staged vote, so it's all fake. 99% of the Germans living there approved Hitler's action, to take over, but they didn't really. And Germany, Great Britain, and France did not defend the Rhineland, so they were considered weak. And they really did behave weakly. They didn't want to get into it with Hitler, and that was the thing. A lot of Hitler's behaviors were allowed to go on because people didn't really believe it would go to the next step, and it kept going, and they kept not believing until it was almost too late. So in 1936, you also had the Spanish Civil War, and you have Generalissimo Francisco Franco, and he was supported by the Catholic Church, and he revolted against the new Republican government. So Hitler and Mussolini send troops and weapons to support Franco, his fascist rebellion. So, they're going to get him in on it too in Spain. The Japanese, you had the Sino, which is Chinese, which Sino is referring to Chinese. So it's basically the Chinese-Japanese war, and they fight in this full-scale conflict. Japan and Italy and Germany all agreed to be the Axis alliance, and in 1937, and basically they're all agreed to divide up Europe and Asia. So Japan gets Asia, and then Italy and Germany will get the rest of Europe. The Japanese imperialists think they have a divine right to control East Asia, so they're going to create this basically like a confederation. Anschluss and the Munich Pact they're going to unite from Austria with Germany. And so in April, they arrested 70,000 Nazi opponents. 99% of these people were Austrian voters who approved forced annexation, which they didn't really. No one opposed Germany. So you have this new government, and they arrested and murdered anybody that got in their way, imprisoned and exiled Jews, and Freud was exiled. Sigmund Freud, the renowned psychologist and scientist, at that point he came to the United States because he was exiled. So that's how he landed here. Eventually, I'm so blank. Albert Einstein was also exiled, and that's how he ended up in the United States too, to work on the H-bomb in 1945. Declared intent to annex the Sudeten land, and it was a territory, and there were 3 million ethnic Germans living there, but it was actually these Germans were living in Western Czechoslovakia. And there again, that's where the borders had been a problem, because all of this kind of got divided up again in the treaty in World War One. So there again, this change in they're not actually, these are Germans, but they're not actually living in Germany. They're living in the Sudetenland. This appeasement with the Munich Pact. So the British and the French appease Hitler, and they agree for Hitler to take over. And this was September 30th, 1938. So you had Chamberlain from Great Britain's Prime Minister, Daladier, Hitler, and Mussolini. They all signed this Munich Pact. This is Chamberlain, Daladier, and then you have Hitler. And so you have March 1939. Hitler violates this Munich Pact that he just signed in 1938. He sent tanks and the troops to take over the rest of Czechoslovakia, which is now the Czech Republic. The European democracies were scared to death, and they had very small armies after World War One because they'd been devastated by World War One. So they had reduced the size of their armies for economic reasons too. And at that point, they didn't really think there would ever be another world war. So Hitler sets out to go and get more land that was taken from Germany, supposedly. Even though they signed the treaty, they say it was taken from them in World War One. So he wants to go in and get Poland so that he can then get into Russia. So his intent is actually to take over Russia too. So in 1939, he stifles his anti-communist beliefs. He's really anti-communist, but he signs this non-aggression pact with Russia and with Joseph Stalin. But he secretly agreed to divide Northern and Southern Europe with him. But he didn't have any intention of actually going through with it. So September 1, 1939, 1.5 million German troops enter Poland from the north, the south, and the west, and they kill men, women, and children that were Polish or spoke Polish. So why? 2 weeks later, the Soviets invade Poland from the east. And so remember now, Hitler and Russia are still together, supposedly. And in 1939, in October, they divide Poland up. Hitler's goal is to destroy Polish civilization, and Stalin wants to regain Polish territory that they had lost in World War One. So for 5 years, the Nazis arrest and deport Soviet enslaved, and they murder millions of Poles. November 1939, the Soviets invade Finland. March 1940, the Finns gave the Soviets a tenth of their nation, just handed it over. This phony war was a three-month stalemate. So April 1940, Hitler invades and conquers Denmark, Norway. In May, he invades the Low Countries, which means Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. And then by late May, tanks are in France. Blitzkrieg means lightning war. And his strategy was speed. He wanted to do it quickly. So they have columns of tanks, artillery, truck-borne infantry, and then they have warplanes, paratroopers that paralyze these people that they were taking over. And Mussolini then declares war on Great Britain and France, and then in June 1940, Germany takes over Paris. The war was only 10 months old, and Germany already controlled most of Europe. They end up with the French basically just roll over and let them do it. So the United States wanted to stay out of the war, and FDR was under extreme pressure by the American public and the Congress to stay out of the war because they were so traumatized by World War One. So for all of the 20s and basically into the 30s, the presidents had to bow to the American public to try to have an isolationist stance. So the United States was secretly on the down low, funding and helping out the Europeans against Hitler, but they couldn't do anything formally because Congress had not declared war at that time. So in 1935, the Neutrality Acts, and they have a series of Neutrality Acts that prohibit the Americans from selling weapons or traveling on ships owned by nations that were at war. 1936, Congress revises it and bans loans to warring nations. 1937, they allow the president to require non-military American goods brought by warring nations to be sold on cash and carry basis. So the nation had to pay cash, and they had to take these American-made goods away in their own ships. So the Americans were not going to help them if you were at war. It would be perceived by the other side as taking sides. So they wanted to stay out of it. They wanted to preserve this trade with the warring nations, but they didn't want to be in the fight. So you have a U.S. Meanwhile, into the 30s, FDR was building up. He knew what was coming, I think, or he had a good idea anyway. He was quietly building up the nation's military capabilities. So they have a special session in September of 1939. Um, in in 39, the United States had 175,000 soldiers in the army, and Germany had 5 million. So you see what a disadvantage we're in. So 40 to 42, FDR spends increase in the army, produces 50,000 combat planes by 1942. And Germany at that point only has 15,000, so that is an advantage for us. 1940, this is the first peacetime conscription in American history, which means what that is, a conscription is a draft. Basically what a draft is. So what they're doing is they're registered 16 million men ages 21 to 35. And it's sort of like selective service. So you have to register so they can get to you quickly if they have to mobilize quickly. And this is just an example. So you have also the Manhattan Project. Germany has all these secret weapons, and Albert Einstein was the Jewish Austrian refugee who had to leave Austria because he was Jewish, came to the United States. So Germany had been trying to create atomic bombs, and so in 1940, the United States starts researching this. Albert Einstein is instrumental in working on this. They had 200,000 people who worked on this project um, on the bomb. And Albert Einstein said later, after the war, he said if he had known what the bombs would do, he would never have helped on this project. And the thing is I've got a newspaper article about a man that lived in Newnan. A friend of mine, her father-in-law, worked on this project. He was a physicist. He lived in Kansas at the time, and he worked on the Manhattan Project. They did a huge article about him because he said that I heard him speak at this friend's house, and I heard him talking about it, and he said that they all did different projects in different locations. Nobody knew what they were working on, but they knew it was top secret, and they were told they were not to speak about it to spouses, family, anybody. They worked on it in all these different parts, and then they ended up putting it together at Los Alamos, New Mexico. They did not know, and there's a military base there still now, but they did not know what the project was that they were working on. They just knew that it was a big deal. So it's actually fascinating how, to not know what you're doing. So you had the Battle of Britain, which was huge, and Hitler was going to try to destroy the Royal Air Force before they invaded. They never could. The Nazis had 2,500 warplanes, and the Royal Air Force had 1,250. So obviously the Brits were going to need help. But the Royal Air Force had a secret technology, which was radar, and they were able to fend off German attack using radar. So you think about all the uses we have for radar. People go and use radar for going fishing, deep sea fishing these days, but they were using it to try to defeat Hitler. So he bombs all the cities in Great Britain, civilian targets, it doesn't matter. He does nighttime raids that are trying to terrorize the British civilians. He is relentless. He wanted to control England. If he got England, that meant he controlled all of Europe. The Blitz was just what that sounds like. It was they killed 43,000 civilians, 2 million people homeless, but it really ticked off the British more than demoralized them. And Hitler was FDR, I'm sorry, was preparing the United States for war, which really ticked off the isolationist Americans. They didn't want to get involved. He was still reelected for the third term. This was before term limits, so he's the only president elected for 4 terms. So you had the Lend-Lease Bill. They're still trying to stay out now. By 1941, they're still trying to stay out of the war. 1941, they provide more military aid to Britain on the QT quietly. He introduced to Congress. They had a bill that allowed him to lend or lease military equipment to any country that the president deemed vital to the defense of the United States, so that qualified Britain. So 1941 to 1945, they shipped $50 billion. In 1940s money values, that's a huge amount worth of supplies to Britain, Soviet Union, France, and China, and other allied nations. So by this time, Soviet Union is on the side of the Brits and the Americans. FDR's biggest effort to move America from isolation to interventionism in Europe and Asia, because remember, Pearl Harbor had not occurred yet. So this is a political cartoon. This is supposed to be Great Britain, the Prime Minister, and they're all taking from, with all the Nazis, they're talking about appeasement, because he was trying to just make them happy, and so they'd stop, and not accepting the fact that it was never going to stop. Hitler was never going to stop. So 1941, Germany joins Italy and Libya, take it to Africa, because they want to, the British have to move back and withdraw to Egypt. So in 41, Germany takes Yugoslavia and Greece. They already had Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. So you see, he's taking all of this area, all of these countries. He's taking more and more and more. June 22nd, 41, he invades his ally, the Soviet Union, to destroy communism, enslave this massive population, exploit all the natural resources that are there. But eventually the Soviets pushed him back and became allies. So the Soviet Union got thousands of trucks, guns, tanks, and warplanes, and they ate Spam. They provided them with cotton, shoes, boots for the entire Russian army. Stalin was forced to fight or be killed by his own army. It was 8,000 civilians. So one of the big problems for Hitler were the fighters in Russia that were so, they were very aggressive. But you also had cold and these vast distances where you had to travel, and you had to take all of your supplies and stuff in this horrible snow. So in the summer of 1941, they had a joint statement of common principles, Churchill and FDR, and so they pledged that after they got rid of the Nazis, they would promote common values of self-determination by all people, basically democracy, economic cooperation, freedom of the seas, and a new international security system, which would become the United Nations. And 11 nations endorsed it, including the Soviets. Then the Germans go and attack the United States ships in the North Atlantic. Okay. So we'll jump over here to December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy. That's from FDR's speech. So Hideki Tojo was the prime minister for Japan in October of 1941. He wants a fatal attack on the U.S. Navy, so they target Pearl Harbor, and Pearl Harbor was kind of an outback kind of place because they just put all of the ships there just as a place to store them, basically. Well, the Japanese go in and they want to make a decisive statement. There were a lot of Japanese living in Hawaii at the time, and they say that there were a lot of. We went to Pearl Harbor to the museum and the ship, but the USS Arizona. But they said there were a lot of Japanese spies that people did not know were there, that helped with the intelligence. So they had 8 battleships that were either sunk or disabled by 360 Japanese planes, kamikazes, the suicide bombers. It was 2 hours worth. They had 2,400 men killed, 1,200 wounded, and they attacked U.S. bases in the Philippines, Guam, the Wake Islands, and British bases in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Malaysia. It was major. and obviously we were in the war by then. They got them because these guys, the naval officers and the Navy, enlisted men, all were kind of just hanging out in Hawaii, having fun, going to the beach, and they were living a pretty decent life at the time. And so at 8 o'clock on a Sunday morning, everybody was quiet. Nobody was really up. So that's when they attacked. So the bombers didn't take out the maintenance facilities, the oil tanks. They missed the U.S. aircraft carriers that were already out to sea. They were away, so they were not able to get them. It motivated the Americans to not be isolationist anymore. They were done with that. When you attack the United States, you're in big trouble. So they started mobilization at home, and we had this immense industrial capacity. What they do is when you have wartime, all of the factories can be refitted for producing things that are needed for war. They can change the factories over to make tanks, airplanes, boots, uniforms, those kinds of things. So December 8th, Congress passes the War Powers Act, which gives him, FDR, the president, extensive authority to reorganize the government, create new agencies, regulate business and industry, censor mail and communications. So it basically gave him a blank check to do whatever he needed to do to fight this war. You had the War Production Board, which is in charge of converting the industry to produce the war necessities. So that's what I was explaining about changing over the factories and converting. So the automobile factories were converted to make tanks, jeeps, warplanes, trucks, and they were very efficient at what they did. So they worked 24/7. They produced 300,000 warplanes, 89,000 tanks, 3 million machine guns, 7 million rifles, and the cost of all of this conversion would be $3 trillion for today. So that's pretty major. What is interesting is that the manufacturers, for car manufacturers, in 1941, they made 3 million cars. In 3 years, they made 139 cars. So what are they making? They're making all of these military vehicles. They're not making cars anymore. If you look at that, that's pretty stark numbers. So they had the Revenue Act of 1942. That was the victory tax. They increased tax rates like crazy. People didn't mind because it was all about the war effort. They sold war bonds, which was a safe way to invest your money. They sold the war bonds so that you would get your money out in 7 years or whatever, and that was a good way to raise money right quick. Federal agencies were created to manage the war economy, and you had these civilian federal workers that they quit to join the army, so somebody had to fill in those gaps. Unemployment in 14% in 1940. If you think about it, that was really basically the end of the Depression, was this war. It was 2% of unemployment in 1943. So really that's how the Depression ended, was getting into World War II. Women went to war, the WACs, the Women's Army Corps. There were 200,000 of those women. They were WAVES, women accepted for volunteer emergency services. And they were also in the Marine Corps, the Coast Guard, and the Army Air Force. 6 million women entered the workforce, so it was a 50% jump. The difference is that women have always gone to work in wartime. This time, though, many of them did not go back home. They stayed in the workforce. So African Americans left the South. 500,000 of them left the South to go north to work in the factories that were producing military goods. 1 million of them joined industries, and they were making decent money in factories. They were involved in constructing military bases, and it was great for the textile mills in the South because they were producing uniforms. 60 of 100 new Army camps in the southern states made all the difference in local economies. So the economy was booming. And the rural population decreased by 20% because they went north and went to cities in general to work in factories. This was the biggest social issue of the day, was the African Americans' participation in the military. They had racially segregated units, and they were initially excluded from combat units, and they could not be in charge of white soldiers or sailors. Army and Navy bases were segregated, and they had lots of racial incidents. There were 1 million African Americans that served in armed forces. There was even a unit of African American women nurses. Those nurses could only take care of African American soldiers, could not take care of the white men and the white soldiers in the army. So there were nurses that were African American, but they only took care of the African American men. The most famous group was the Tuskegee Airmen. They flew 15,000 missions, and they were amazing. They fought to desegregate the army after the war. These Tuskegee Airmen, obviously, they were trained at Tuskegee. The white pilots, their goal was to escort the bombers, to make sure that the bombers got where they were going on these missions. So the Tuskegee Airmen were sent to protect them. So they would, distract attention for the enemy's attention, so the bombers could get to where they needed to go to drop the bombs. But the white soldiers didn't like it because they were black, and they thought they were not capable. After the first mission, they changed their minds when they saw how they could fly. And so after that, they were all, the white soldiers were all about the Tuskegee Airmen. The Tuskegee Airmen never lost a bomber. They never, in all the years that they existed, and they existed after the war for several years. And there's several of them that I've met that live in Noonan. They're the younger ones from the 50s. But the Tuskegee Airmen continued on after World War II. But they impressed the pilots of the bombers so much that they wanted the Tuskegee Airmen to go with them because they knew they would protect them. War relocation camps. It was Japanese internment. And what they did is the government was so worried about traitors and spies in the Japanese communities, particularly in the West, that they had these internment camps. It's like concentration camps, basically. However, the United States government did not kill these people. They were not going to eliminate them. They just were going to house them so they could not be spies, which was totally unreasonable, but it shows you how paranoid people were. These Japanese Americans lost their businesses, their homes, because if you were stuck in a camp, you can't work. They lost their businesses. They had 39,000 Japanese Americans in the army, and they experienced racial prejudice and fear. They housed them in horse racing tracks and in the stables. Most of them, 60% of them plus, were American citizens, and then a third of these people were under 19 years old. So, I mean, they weren't going to be spies. They were little kids. The new technologies from World War II. You had radar and sonar. You had groups that the tactics were different. You had convoys that went with the warships. You had submarine warfare that was more common. They had new radio codes. They used the Navajo code breakers. And you had D-Day, which was June 6th, 1944, which was the biggest invasion in history. and it was in Normandy, and so they talk about it every year, and they have a ceremony every year, except this past year because they had the coronavirus. You had Omaha Beach and Utah Beach. These were the code names. So you had all these huge cliffs. They had to 130-foot cliff. They had to scale, and so 90% of these people were lost. They had 156,000 Allied soldiers along 50 miles of coastline. So it was a huge operation. 7 weeks later, they liberated Paris, but they lost 37,000 more lives. The Germans lost 2 times that much. So you have the Allies coming in and saving all of these, liberating these countries. So FDR dies in spring of 1945 in Warm Springs, down at Warm Springs, Georgia, the little house. You can go there and visit if you would like. It's amazing. You should go and visit the little White House. He spent a lot of time there. Germany collapses April 30th. Hitler marries his longtime girlfriend, Eva Braun. They commit suicide in an underground bunker. Both of them do. In the Pacific Theater, the United States surrenders the Philippines in early spring 1942. Japanese in control of the Pacific, and they were almost set to attack Australia. Admiral Yamamoto takes Midway, the Battle of Midway, and the westernmost island of Hawaii, and wants to attack Pearl Harbor again. But the Americans broke military code, so they figured out what he was going to do. So this was the first major defeat of Japanese Navy in 350 years, was at Midway, so it was a turning point in the war. And okay, we'll stop here. So I'll tell you what, we need to talk about this. The Iwo Jima and Okinawa in 1945. So the Iwo Jima, you had issues with flying this far from the South Pacific to the North Pacific, but they were trying to invade Japan, and so they knew that if they tried to take Japan by land, that they would have 500,000 deaths. So, but the scientists underestimated the bomb's capability. These people had tested this bomb, or these 2 different bombs. They had tested them out, but they didn't really know what they were capable of. So it's kind of scary that they dropped bombs that they didn't know what they would do. They said the military estimates that had they not dropped the bombs, that another 1 million American soldiers would have died. So, it sounds horrible that they dropped these awful nuclear bombs on these people in Japan, but the Japanese were never going to surrender. So there was not really an option. So, August 6th, plane goes, the Enola Gay is the plane, takes a 5-ton, 10-foot long uranium bomb called Little Boy. This is Little Boy. So this 5-ton, 10 feet long, it's not that big to make an impression like that. Pretty amazing. I mean, it's scary how amazing it is. So they go the 6th, and they drop, the Enola Gay flies, and they drop the bomb on Hiroshima. And then, so you had 78,000 killed, and out of those people, there were 23 American POWs that died. At 1 year, you had 140,000 who had died from radiation poisoning. It killed 70,000. It destroyed 70,000 buildings, totally annihilated 4 square miles, and there was a 20,000-foot tall mushroom cloud. Nagasaki was August the 9th, because the Japanese, after the first one at Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the Japanese still didn't surrender. So 3 days later, August 9th, Fat Man is the other bomb. And by this time, Truman was the president. And so he was worried the Japanese were not going to surrender. They dropped the other bomb on Nagasaki, and August 14th, the Japanese finally surrendered. So the cost of the war, 20 million Soviet lives, 10 million Chinese lives, 5.6 million Germans, 2.3 million Japanese, 292,000 combat victims, 114,000 non-combat, a million wounded, and 1 American for every 59 Soviets. So we lost 1 American, and they lost 59 Soviets. Their deaths were major losses. African colonies crumbled. These nations, the European nations, were unable to maintain their colonies in Africa, so they pulled out, and that's where you get the current countries, or basically the current countries. Fascism and Nazism were destroyed. India and Pakistan became nations. The UN was created. The Soviets became a superpower. The Yalta Declaration requires supposedly free and open elections in Eastern Europe. And that really didn't happen. The United States had no real leverage on Eastern Europe to force that. So this is long, and I'm sorry about that. But at least it gives you a clue about what you're reading about World War II. And I hope it helps. If you have any questions at all, just feel free to ask.